Alright, welcome to a very special video. Today we are breaking down a layman's guide to, and this type of layman, a person without professional or specialized knowledge in a particular subject. So if you're kind of just an AI coder, if you got into coding using AI and you're not exactly sure how stuff works, but you're still managed to build, well, I'm going to break down suspense on the server and also on the client in Next.js and how you can handle that. And this is an example of what we'll be building, or what I'll show you how I built, is this dashboard. So we have two types of suspense on this page, and if I hit Command-Shift-R, hard refresh, we can see we have suspense on these components here. So these are actually server components. This page is rendered on the server, and then we have suspense here to show before we drop this number in. And in this case, for this title up here, this is actually on the client. So as soon as this whole top component loads, it looks at the URL and then it fetches this data that we want. So I'm going to break down these two types and show you how it works. So the first one, we'll start with on the client. And on the client, data fetching is useful for things like infinite scroll or maybe load more, but I think you can do load more buttons with server-side rendering. With things like this, so this is something I was struggling with for a long time. We have our layout file here, and we have a header, and let me just show you the header title. This depends on the path parameters and the query parameters, okay? Because we have a list type, so I'll show you the URL. So we have a customer, this is where the layout is. So we can see that the layout is in the same directory as the customer. And then the list is a sub path, and then we have an item. So this is an analytics page, and it's pretty dynamic, so we can add different things. But the point is, your layout can't actually access these parameters. The list and the item cannot be accessed by the layout because it's in a separate directory. And so you can't access the params of child routes. That's basically the issue here. And how do you render the name up here if you can't do it? Well, let's go to Vercel. And I have Vercel on a fast 4G connection here. And what we can see is that this header, so we're at my organization / a project, but if we go back to my organization, this header is still the same. And so what I believe is that they're actually using client-side rendering for this header. And if we go to site settings and block JavaScript, then we go back to Vercel and hit refresh, well, nothing loads. So from what I believe, they're actually doing a lot of this on the client side, but particularly the header is on the client side. And this is crazy. I don't know if you've ever tried this, but if you turn off JavaScript on Vercel's website, nothing loads. And maybe that's because it has to hydrate from the server. It needs to, swap things out. But either way, this header, I believe, has to be client-side rendered. And so, in my case, because we're using path parameters that we can't access by default, we have to use this method, useParams, which is a client-side method which will allow us to get those parameters even if it's a member of a child route. So this is what we do. We use params, and we get our path parameters and our query parameters. And then I'm using tanstack query, but you could just use useEffect if you wanted. I like tanstack query quite a lot though. And here's what we do. So for this header title, this is the dynamic part. We have a query key, which basically tells tanstack how to cache this, what it depends on. And then we use this query. This is basically like a useEffect where you would run your function, and that would call a server action. So you can see this file is a server component, and it basically, when you land on this page, this function will run on your client. It'll go to this server, it'll make a post request to your page to get this data, and then once the data is ready, so once isLoading is false, it will display it. So there's no use state, there's no useEffect. It's all handled by useQuery, which is really nice. And what we have is a shimmer component here. I'll show you this because Notion and Vercel use shimmer, but a lot of people just use kind of pulsing in and out for skeletons. But I really like this shimmer component. You can see it has these lines, this line that like swipes through. By the way, check this out in dark mode, dude. She looks so fucking clean. But this is how you do client-side suspense. And the downside of this is I had basically every single page, every single component on my app previously was all client-side rendered. And I kind of thought I had to do it, but then I realized I could do server-side for the rest of it. So in this case, we're using client-side only for the reason that we can't access the parameters unless this is client-side rendered. And you could probably hack it together if you'd used, like, you know, just get the URL from the request and then pull out the parameters and do all this. But I'm not really a fan of that approach, just because things can change and break, and I would rather have it be client-side rendered, where you can, because this isn't a lot of JavaScript. This is a very simple fetch request, and all you're doing is swapping out a title. Like, there's no logic going on here, really, besides like basic use effect and use state. And this is pretty light. But when you start loading up a ton of client components, your page gets really slow, and I was having weird bugs with this calendar, with this date picker. It kind of became a mess. And so, for most use cases, you want to go to server components. And here's how you do it. So we are on the location list page. And so this is that list component. And basically, this is a server component. Okay, so we don't have use client at the top, and it's rendered by, or it's just, I mean, it's a page. So if you don't have use client at the top, by default, it's going to be a server component. And this is helpful because we have this switch statement here. So if the list is locations or users, we're going to drop in a different component here. And that's good, because if this was a client component, you would have to ship both of these components down to the client, and then you would have to have JavaScript that basically figures out which one to drop in there. And so you're doubling your payload essentially. Whereas if you do this on the server, you don't have to ship as much. You ship literally half as much. You only ship this one component down to the client, which saves a ton of bandwidth on their computer and also just makes things way faster. So anyways, in this locations analytics file, we'll see that this is also a server component. There's no use client at the top. And the way this works is we have our locations table, which is this component right here, and this has a server function right here, which is locations table client. And so we're calling this client, this client component. So if I click on this, this is a client component, and this has, basically, we have a use router and a handle click. So this is a function that has to be run on the client. And so this is the actual component that we're going to be showing. But how we get that is we wrap this whole function, this whole section, the locations table component. So this whole component is wrapped in suspense. And so if I get rid of this fallback, we'll just replace this with div loading. And now you can see kind of how it looks. So we have our async component. See, this is async as well, but it's because it's run on the server, but we're not actually awaiting anything in this function. We're only awaiting something in this function. So this one won't have a fetch request, because if you did await new promise and resolve, then you wouldn't actually have, this would wait this amount of time before it runs. Okay, if that makes sense. So before it starts rendering the suspense, and that makes your page slow. So what you do is you make sure that the slow component, the one that has the fetching logic, is dropped inside of the suspense, and then this overall component has no waiting step, right? So once you load in, then you'll see that it says loading right here instantly. As soon as the page loads, as soon as you get the first content paint, this loading comes with it. And we could actually probably just simplify this by doing this, and then I'll paste in our suspense component. and then I can get rid of this. And this is actually what the component looks like. And as you can see, we have our asynchronous operation within this component. So React knows that this is an asynchronous function, and so it's going to show the suspense until this asynchronous function is done running. So hopefully I haven't beaten that to death, but it makes sense. And now, when we render the page, it'll show that loading state. And for some reason, it's still showing loading, ... Oh. I thought oh, I have two suspense. Wait. Stand by. This is not how it's supposed to look. There. That's the actual suspense component. So we have our data table, and we have an isLoading flag that we're passing through, which basically tells each row to render that suspense component right there. And that's really all there is to it. The thing I was doing earlier was I was awaiting it at the top of the suspense and then thinking that it would know that the data for that component is being rendered still, but no, you have to have a separate component which is asynchronous, and then that is inside of the main suspense container. And so you could also, I'm just doing it kind of fancy like, but you could do const data equals await this and then just drop data in right there. And that would do the exact same thing, it's just more compact if you put the await directly into the data field, which is what I'm doing in my case. And yeah, dude, this has been an insane increase in speed. And so I have this at with throttling, and I also have a random delay on this component. So if we come back to data views, locations table, so this has a random delay right here, and so do these charts, these stats things. And so now, if I refresh this page, bam, it's like instant, dude. These are client components, so you can see this has a hover effect, and you know, this is a table, obviously. It has like interactivity, but you're dropping the data in from the server, so it doesn't have to actually be hydrated. It's just swapping out the HTML, which is way fucking easier. And as you can see, we get a fresh paint every time we hit reload. And I think it's using some sort of cache, because you can see when I hit reload initially, this number will change, I think, to the last rendered number. And while the page is loading, it makes a fetch in the background, and then when that data is ready, then it swaps it out. So I'm using random numbers here, which causes all this data to instantly switch right after the load is done. But in most cases, this should just remain the same because the data is not changing really between like reloads. So that's really all there is to it. I would, for you, I would try to render as much as possible on the server. Anything that needs interactivity, you can always just drop the data in from the server once it's ready and use suspense. And yeah, I would spend some time creating your suspense components because this shimmer just looks so fucking sick. And I'll show you what this this suspense looks like. So if we go to this data table, so we see isLoading is true, and then if we come down to this, then we'll see that okay, so here's how it works. So isLoading, we have a special file full of different types of cells, of data cells, and we can see this is what it looks like. So if isLoading is true, then we're going to return shimmer, and we can pass in our class name, which is basically the size. So coming back here, we're passing in height of 5 and width of 48, and this is what the shimmer actually looks like. It's absolute, it's wrapped in this relative overflow hidden, BG muted, and then we have this custom animation which runs. And I will show you that as well. So globals, and we have some animation in here. So that is Yeah, so that's in the Tailwind config, and we have an animation, which is shimmer. Shimmer 2 seconds, ease in, out, infinite. And this is what that shimmer actually looks like. 0% background position minus 200, and then background position 200. So that just means that for half the time, this shimmer is actually hidden, but when it does run, it runs straight through as a color that's gradual. And it just looks fucking sick. And yeah, that's basically the whole video. Hope you enjoyed.